The auger arrays registered nothing. The astropaths saw only static. The tech priests of the Cadian 99th declared the readings impossible, yet across 17 sub-sectors of the trench line, the silence had become a physical weight. On the world of Atria III, a world defined by its grey rain and its vital promethium refineries, the war had simply stopped. Trooper Elias Thorne blinked away the stinging salt of the trench slurry. He was slumped against a damp sandbag, his laser gun cradled in his arms like a dying child. The weapon's power cell hummed with a faint, reassuring warmth. The only warmth left in a world that had gone cold and wet. Elias had been in the mud for 300 days, long enough to know the rhythmic heartbeat of Imperial artillery. Then the thud shudder of the basilisk batteries was the only lullaby a guardsman ever needed. But the guns had gone silent an hour ago, or perhaps it had been a lifetime. Time in the trenches was a fluid, treacherous thing. "Vance? Kroll?" Elias rasped. His voice was a dry rattle, his throat raw from the caustic fog that rolled off the no-man's land. There was no answer, only the sound of the rain. It didn't patter against his flak helmet. It slapped, heavy and thick, like the sound of wet meat hitting a stone floor. Elias forced himself to stand, his joints screaming in protest. The mud reached for his boots, a hungry, clinging sludge that smelled of iron and stagnant rot. He looked down the line of Sector 7. The trench was empty. Not abandoned, but empty. The mess tins were still steaming on the small chem stoves. His half-played deck of Emperor's Tarot lay scattered on a crate, the despair card face up in the muck. The vox-caster in the command dugout was spitting out a low-frequency hiss, a sound like a million insects rubbing their legs together. 99th Regiment, this is Trooper Thorne, he muttered into his own bead vox, his finger trembling on the transmit stud. Does anyone copy? Sector 7 is... The sector is unresponsive. Requesting status update. Static. Then a voice. It wasn't a human voice. It was a wet, rhythmic breathing that seemed to come from inside the Vox unit itself. Here. It sounded like a man drowning in his own lungs. Elias stepped back, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He looked toward the firing step, squinting into the fog that choked the no-man's land. The fog wasn't white or grey, and it was a bruised, sickly yellow, pulsating with a faint, internal light. It moved against the wind, a deliberate, predatory crawl that was swallowing the barbed wire and the tank traps. And then he saw them. Shadows. Not men, but the absence of light. Along the reinforced plasteel walls of the bunker, Elias saw the silhouettes of his squad. They were burned into the metal, frozen in poses of absolute terror. Sarge was there, his hand reaching for a pistol that wasn't there. Kroll was curled in a fetal ball. The shadows didn't move, but as Elias watched, a drop of the thick black rain ran down the wall, and the shadow of Sarge appeared to weep. "By the throne," Elias whispered, clutching his Aquila pendant. "What is this? What have you done to them?" He checked his laser gun's charge. 98%. The small green light was the only thing that felt real. He began to walk, hugging the side of the trench, his eyes darting to every corner. The architecture of the trench seemed to be shifting. The sharp angles of the Cadian engineering were softening, the metal becoming porous and damp, like old bone. He reached the first aid station. The smell hit him before the sight did, a cloying sweet stench of overripe fruit and gangrene. It was the smell of a garden that had been left to rot for 1,000 years. Inside, the medicae servitor sat motionless, its surgical limbs locked in a permanent spasm. Elias saw a shape on the gurney, a survivor. "Hold on, soldier," Elias said, his training taking over. He moved to the man's side, but as he reached out, he froze. It was Trooper Miller, or what was left of him. Miller's skin wasn't pale, and it was translucent, and beneath the surface, things were moving. Not parasites, but blooms. Tiny purple flowers with teeth were erupting from his pores, their petals wet with a rhythmic, pulsing nectar. Miller's eyes were gone, replaced by two large weeping fungi that hummed a low, dissonant chord. Miller's mouth opened. He didn't scream. He spoke with a voice that sounded like dry leaves. "He is coming, Elias. The gardener is coming to pull the weeds." A distant sound echoed across the mud. It was the tolling of a bell. It was a heavy, rusted sound that didn't vibrate in the air, but in Elias's teeth. Clang, clang, clang. With every strike, the yellow fog grew thicker, and the smell of the rot grew sweeter. Elias Thorne, a son of Cadia, felt a coldness in his soul that no winter could match. Also, he was alone in a world that was being unmade by a god of decay, and the only thing he had left was a gun that could only kill things that were still alive. If you crave stories of cosmic collisions and impossible heroes, smash that subscribe button. The Emperor protects those who bear witness to the Dark Millennium. The tolling of the bell was not a sound. It was an infection. With every strike, the yellow fog curdled, thickening into a soup of airborne spores that coated Elias's respirator grill in a fine gray fur. He scrambled back from the gurney where Miller sat, if that thing could still be called a man, and stumbled into the central corridor of the bunker. The light strips overhead flickered with a dying orange pulse. They weren't failing because of a power surge. They were being strangled. Thick, ropey vines of a dark, vein-like consistency were winding around the light fixtures, pulsing in time with the distant bell. The plasteel walls felt soft to the touch, yielding like bruised fruit under his fingers. "Emperor, preserve me," Elias breathed, his voice muffled by the rubber of his mask. The air is heavy." He needed to find the command center. If the Vox caster was still functional, he could call for a Valkyrie extraction or, at the very least, a heavy mortar strike on his own position. Anything was better than waiting to become a garden for the things growing in the dark. He turned a corner and nearly collided with a shape hanging from the ceiling. He raised his laser gun, the bayonet tip trembling. It was Corporal Holloway. She was suspended by a web of glistening, translucent filaments that looked like spider silk but smelled like a morgue. Her eyes were wide, her pupils dilated until they were nothing but black voids. She wasn't dead. Her chest was rising and falling in a shallow, rapid rhythm, and her lips were moving in a silent, frantic prayer. "Holloway, can you hear me?" Elias hissed, reaching for his combat knife to cut her down. "Don't," she whispered. The word didn't come from her throat. It seemed to vibrate out of the very air around her. "If you break the thread, the music stops. And if the music stops, he notices you." "Who? Who is noticed?" "The Tallyman," she croaked. "He's counting, Elias. He's counting every breath we take, every beat of our hearts. He's making sure the sum of our rot is correct." A wet, dragging sound echoed from the end of the hall. Schlick, thump, schlick, thump. Elias didn't stay to argue. He turned and ran, his boots splashing in a liquid that was too thick to be water and too pale to be blood. He reached the command dugout and slammed the manual override, the heavy iron door hissing shut with a sound of grinding metal that felt dangerously fragile. Though the room was filled with the rhythmic clicking of cogitators. The green text on the screens was scrolling at an impossible speed, but it wasn't binary code anymore. It was a series of symbols that looked like 3 overlapping circles, the mark of the plague god. Elias threw himself at the main Vox console. "Command, this is Thorne. Sector 7 has been compromised by warp taint. Requesting immediate fire support. Does anyone copy?" The Vox emitted a screech of feedback that made Elias's ears bleed. Then the static cleared. "Trooper Thorne," a voice said. It was cold, metallic, and devoid of any human emotion. "This is the inquisitorial representative aboard the Divine Verdict. We have been monitoring your sector's bio-readings." "Thank the throne," Elias sobbed. his head slumping against the console. "Get us out of here, please." "Negative." "Trooper," the voice replied. "The contagion in your sector has reached a Tier 4 saturation. The warp pocket has solidified around your coordinates. You're no longer within the materium of the Imperium." Elias froze. "What do you mean?" "I'm still on Atria III. I can see the refinery towers from the firing step." "What you see is a memory, Thorne. The planet has moved on. You are trapped in a fold of the Immaterium. The divine verdict has moved to a high-anchor orbit to commence a localized cleansing. We cannot allow the Tallyman's ledger to be completed." "Cleansing? You mean..." "Exterminatus is a heavy word for a single trench, Trooper. We prefer the term sanctification. You have 10 minutes to prepare your soul for the Emperor's presence. Die with honor. The Emperor protects." The Vox went dead. Elias stared at the silent console. In 10 minutes. He had 10 minutes before the orbital lances turned this rotting hellscape into a world of glass. He looked at his lace gun. 2 charge packs, a handful of grenades. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't a space marine. He was just a man from Cadia who had survived 100 battles only to be told his death was a footnote in an Inquisitor's report. The heavy iron door of the dugout began to groan. Something was leaning against it. Something very, very heavy. Clang. The bell sounded again, and this time it was right outside the door. The smell of the rot became so intense that Elias's respirator filters finally failed. He ripped the mask off, gagging as the air hit his lungs. It tasted like ash and honey. "Come on then, you bastards," Elias roared, leveling his laser gun at the door. "I'm Cadian. We don't die in the dark." The plasteel door didn't burst open. It began to melt. Not from heat, but from a rapid, accelerated corrosion. The metal turned to orange rust and then to dust, falling away in large flakes. Standing in the doorway was a figure that blotted out the flickering light. It was 7 feet tall, clad in power armor that was a rusted, weeping ruin of its former glory. The ceramite was cracked, revealing a mass of bloated, gray flesh that pulsed with a life of its own. A single, fly-blown horn protruded from the side of its helmet, and it carried a massive, scythe-like blade that dripped with a black, viscous ichor. The Plague Marine didn't attack. It stood there, its single eye lens glowing with a dull, sickly green light. It raised a hand, and the flies that had been buzzing in the room suddenly fell silent. "So small," the giant rumbled, its voice a wet, vibrating bass. "So much fear for such a tiny spark of life. Do not worry, little mortal. The Grandfather does not want your death. He wants your growth." Elias squeezed the trigger. The last bolt struck the giant's chest, a brilliant beam of red light that carved a smoking hole in the rotted armor. The Plague Marine didn't even flinch. It looked down at the wound, watched as a cluster of maggots swarmed into the hole to knit the flesh back together, and then looked back at Elias. "Is that the best your corpse god can offer?" the giant asked, stepping into the room. "A candle against the coming of the night?" Elias backed away, his boots hitting the edge of the command console. He was trapped. 10 minutes until the sky fell, and a god of death was standing in his doorway. And he didn't pray for his life. He prayed for his aim. The Plague Marine's presence was a physical pressure, a localized gravity of despair that made the air in the dugout feel like liquid lead. Elias fired again and again and again. The red beams of his laser gun punched into the rusted ceramite, each shot a frantic prayer to a silent throne. The giant didn't raise his scythe. He simply walked through the fire, the scorch marks on his chest blooming into weeping sores that hissed with a sickly, sweet-smelling steam. "A disciplined rhythm," the giant rumbled, the sound vibrating in Elias's very teeth. "Cadian bread. I remember the smell of your world. It smelled of stone and stubbornness. Now it is just dust." Elias's laser gun emitted a sharp, high-pitched whine. The cell was empty. He fumbled at his webbing, his fingers slick with the black moisture dripping from the ceiling. He slammed a fresh pack into the weapon, the click of the locking mechanism the only defiant sound in the room. "Stay back!" Elias roared, his voice cracking. "I've seen your kind die. I've seen the tanks grind you into the mud." "Many things die in the mud, little soldier," the plague marine said, stopping just 3 paces away. The scent of him was overwhelming, a concentrated essence of 1 billion years of stagnant ponds and unwashed wounds. But in the grandfather's garden, death is merely a transformation. You're terrified of the end. You're terrified of the silence that follows your final breath. I offer you a life that never ends, a cycle of blooming and rot that defies the cold stars. "I'd rather burn," Elias spat, his hand moving to the frag grenade on his belt. The giant tilted his helm, the single green eye lens flickering. "To know the Inquisitor's fire, it is coming. I can feel the orbital arrays humming in the void. They will turn this mud to glass, thinking they can cauterize the truth. But the rot is not in the ground, Elias. It is in the heart of your Imperium. It is in the fear you feel right now." Suddenly, the Vox console behind Elias sparked with a new signal. It wasn't the cold voice of the Inquisitor. It was a cacophony of screams layered over a rhythmic, mechanical chanting. "The tally is incomplete. 7-fold the misery, 7-fold the gift." The plague marine turned his head toward the Vox. A low, wet chuckle escaped his grill. The tallyman is impatient. He has counted the shadows on the wall. He has counted the petals on Miller's eyes. But he needs one more soul to balance the ledger of Sector 7, a soul of pure Cadian iron to act as the anchor. "Not me," Elias whispered. He didn't fire the laser gun. He knew it was useless. Instead, he lunged for the manual override of the emergency floor vent, a narrow, sludge-filled drainage pipe that led to the sump levels beneath the trench. It was a desperate, suicidal gamble. The pipes were flooded with caustic runoff and the waste of 10,000 men, but it was the only place the giant couldn't follow. The plague marine raised his scythe, the rusted blade whistling through the air. Elias felt the wind of the strike pass inches from his head as he tumbled into the dark, wet mouth of the vent. He didn't fall. He slid. The pipe was coated in a thick, bioluminescent slime that glowed with a faint, necrotic green. He plummeted through the darkness, the smell of ammonia and methane stinging his eyes, until he hit a pool of stagnant water with a bone-jarring splash. He came up gasping, his lungs burning. He was in the sump, the lightless veins of the trench system. Above him, he could hear the heavy, rhythmic thud of the plague marine's boots against the plasteel floor of the dugout. Thump, thump, thump. Then, silence. Elias pulled himself onto a rusted metal walkway, his laser gun still clutched in his hand. The water around his waist was thick with floating debris, shredded uniforms, bloated ration packs, and things that looked too much like human limbs. The air down here was cold, a sharp contrast to the humid heat of the rot above. "Thorne." The whisper didn't come from the Vox. It came from the water. Elias raised his weapon, the small lamp pack on the barrel cutting a narrow path through the gloom. The beam hit a pile of rubble, and for a second, he saw a face. It was his father, the man who had died on the ramparts of Kasser Tyrok, his chest opened by an orc's chopper. "Dad?" Elias choked out, his discipline flickering. "Why are you running, Elias?" the face in the water asked. Its eyes were milky, and a small purple flower was blooming from its ear. "The mud is warm, the mud is home. Why fight the inevitable? Join us, the ledger is almost full." The water began to ripple. More faces appeared, the men of his platoon, the ghosts of Cadia, all of them smiling with mouths filled with moss. They weren't just hallucinations. The warp pocket was reaching into his mind, using his own grief to weave a shroud of despair. "You're not real," Elias hissed, backing away. "You're just filth. Warp filth." Clang. The bell tolled again, but this time the sound came from below. The water began to churn, and a massive, bloated shape began to rise from the sump pool. It wasn't a marine. It was a creature of pure, distilled filth. A great unclean one's lesser spawn, a mass of weeping fat and grinning mouths that giggled as it tasted the air. Elias checked his chrono. 6 minutes until the orbital strike. He was trapped in a sewer with the ghosts of his past and a demon of the present. He looked at the walkway, which led deeper into the darkness toward the refinery's primary heat sink. If he could reach it, the explosion of the promethium might create a flicker of real fire, a momentary shield against the shadows. "Cadians don't die in the dark," he repeated, his mantra a shield against the whispering water. He turned and ran, his boots clattering on the metal grate, while behind him the giggling grew louder. The sump level was a lightless throat, and Elias was being swallowed. Every step on the rusted metal grate produced a hollow, mocking ring that seemed to call out to the giggling mass rising behind him. His lamp pack flickered, the beam dying as the thick, humid air of the sump began to coat the lens in a layer of oily condensation. "Don't look back," he hissed to himself, the mantra now his only tether to reality. "Focus on the objective. Move or die." The walkway ended abruptly at a massive circular bulkhead, the seal encrusted with a calcified, coral-like growth that hummed with a low-frequency vibration. This was the primary heat sink junction for the refinery. Beyond it lay the promethium reserves, millions of gallons of high-grade fuel that, if detonated, would turn this entire subsector into a sun for a single, glorious second. If the Inquisitor wanted to sanctify the ground, Elias would help him light the match. He jammed his combat knife into the seam of the bulkhead, prying at the rotted seal. The metal groaned, a sound like a wounded animal. As the door began to yield, the whispering in the water behind him reached a fever pitch. It wasn't just voices anymore. It was the sound of wet, heavy things dragging themselves out of the pool. Schlick, thump, schlick. Elias turned, his lamp pack catching a glimpse of the horror. It wasn't just one spawn. The water was birthing a tide of Nurglings, tiny, pot-bellied demons with needle teeth and oversized tongues. They were scrambling over each other, a carpet of green-gray flesh led by the bloated, multi-mouthed entity that had first emerged. "Get back!" Elias screamed, firing a blind volley into the mass. The last bolts vaporized several of the tiny creatures, their tiny lungs letting out shrieks of foul-smelling gas. But there were hundreds of them. They moved with a manic, joyous energy, as if the impending destruction of the world was nothing more than a grand game. The larger spawn opened a central mouth that split its torso in half. "Elias, the Tally needs a name. Take this one." Elias pulled the pin on his frag grenade and hurled it into the center of the pool. He didn't wait for the explosion. He threw his shoulder against the bulkhead door, sliding through the gap as the grenade detonated. The shockwave rattled the pipes, followed by the sound of shrieking demons and the splash of scalding, tainted water. He slammed the door shut and engaged the manual lock. He was in the heat sink chamber, and it was a cathedral of copper pipes and massive brass turbines, all of them silent. The air here was drier, but the rot had still found its way in. The promethium pipes were covered in a layer of white, fuzzy mold that looked like frost, but felt like warm fur. Elias checked his chrono. 4 minutes. "Okay," he panted, his hands shaking as he approached the primary pressure valve. Cadian Field Manual, Chapter 12. Sabotage and denied access. Increase the pressure, bypass the cooling vents, and wait for the spark. He grabbed the massive iron wheel and turned. It didn't budge. The mechanism was fused, not by rust, but by a thick, amber-like resin that smelled of pine and old blood. "No, no, no!" He hammered at the valve with the butt of his laser gun. "Turn, you piece of junk! Turn!" "It will not turn, Elias." The voice was calm, so it didn't come from the water or the vox. It came from the shadows of the turbine. Elias spun, his laser gun leveled. A man stepped into the light. He wore the remains of a Cadian officer's uniform, but the rank slides had been torn away. His skin was the color of a bruised plum, and his eyes were missing, replaced by two perfectly bloomed roses of a deep velvet red. "Major Castor," Elias whispered. Castor had been the commander of the 99th, a man of iron discipline who had led the charge at the siege of Kasser Myrok. "The Major is gone," the man said, his voice strangely melodic. He was holding a small silver bell, similar to the one the Plague Marine had carried. "There is only the gardener now. We were wrong, Thorne. The Emperor is a cold, distant father who demands only our deaths. But the grandfather wants us to grow. He wants us to be beautiful." Castor gestured to the room. "Look at the Prometheum. It is so volatile, so angry. It wants to burn, but we have calmed it. We have given it the gift of stagnation. It will never explode. It will simply sit here, thickening into a rich, black nectar that will feed the world above for an eternity." "You're a traitor," Elias spat, his finger tightening on the trigger. "I'm a survivor," Castor countered. "And so are you. That is why the Tallyman chose you. Your will to live is so strong it can anchor this entire warp fold. If you accept the gift, the Inquisitor's lance will pass through us like a ghost. We will exist in the fold, a secret garden in the heart of the void." Elias looked at the valve, then at the man who had once been his hero. The betrayal stung worse than the spores. The Emperor protects," Elias said, his voice low and hard. "Does he?" Castor smiled, and a maggot crawled out from between his teeth. "Then why are you alone in the dark?" Elias didn't answer with words. He fired. The last bolt punched through Castor's chest, but the man didn't fall. He simply looked down at the hole, where the red roses in his eyes began to weep a thick golden syrup. "The tally must be balanced, Elias," Castor said, beginning to ring the silver bell. Ting, ting, ting. The sound was high and sharp, cutting through the low hum of the heatsink. Outside the bulkhead, the Nurglings began to scratch at the metal, their tiny claws sounding like rain. Elias realized he couldn't turn the valve. He couldn't blow the Prometheum. He had failed his mission, his regiment, and his world. He looked at his laser gun. 3 minutes. To let the mud take him. Just a small Panzershund. To let the mud take him. Just a small mark on the ledger, Castor whispered. Elias bit his tongue, the sharp pain and the taste of blood snapping him back to the present. He wasn't going to be a mark on anyone's ledger. He reached into his webbing and pulled out his last remaining item, a melter charge meant for anti-tank duty. He hadn't used it because the blast radius in this confined space would vaporize him instantly. "The tally's gonna be short one name, Major," Elias said, his voice steady. He didn't plant the charge on the valve. He planted it directly onto the main Prometheum feeder line, a pipe the size of a Lehman Russ's barrel. The Castor's smile vanished. "You'll destroy everything, yourself, the garden, the memories of Cadia." "Cadia stands," Elias said, his thumb hovering over the detonator. "Even if I don't. If you crave stories of cosmic collisions and impossible heroes, smash that subscribe button. The Emperor protects those who bear witness to the Dark Millennium." The melter charge hummed against the Prometheum line, its magnetic clamps hissing as they bit through the white, fuzzy mold. The sound was a sharp, mechanical contrast to the wet, organic symphony of the sump. Major Castor, or the thing wearing his skin, stepped forward, the silver bell in his hand, trembling. The roses in his eye sockets pulsed, a deep, bruised crimson that seemed to drain the color from the rest of the room. "You don't understand the mathematics of this, Elias," Castor said, his voice now a chorus of buzzing flies. "If you detonate that charge, you aren't just killing yourself. You are erasing the only proof that the 99th ever existed. The Inquisitor will scrub this world from the star charts. The Grandfather offers you a way to be remembered forever in the rot. Why choose the void?" "Because the void is clean," Elias rasped. He didn't look at the detonator. He looked at his own hands. They were shaking, the skin beginning to gray under the fingernails. The spores were winning. He could feel the heavy, sweet lethargy spreading through his veins, the siren call of the mud telling him to just lie down and let the flowers bloom. Schlick, thud. The bulkhead door groaned. The Nurglings were no longer scratching, they were chewing. The metal was thinning, turning to a porous, rusted lace. In a matter of seconds, the tide of filth would pour into the chamber. Elias checked his chrono. 2 minutes, high above, miles of rock and atmosphere away. The divine verdict would be aligning its lance arrays. The tech priests would be chanting the litanies of erasure, and the Inquisitor would be turning a key to delete 1 billion lives in the name of purity. "One last tally, Elias," Castor whispered, raising the silver bell. "One last beat of your heart." Castor lunged. For a man filled with rot, he moved with a terrifying liquid speed. He didn't use a weapon. He reached for Elias with fingers that had elongated into weeping, vine-like tendrils. Elias didn't raise his lasgun. He swung it. He used the heavy plasteel stock of the weapon to strike Castor across the face, the impact shattering the roses in the Major's eyes. Instead of blood, a spray of thick, black nectar coated Elias's visor. Castor recoiled, a wet, bubbling shriek escaping his throat. Elias didn't wait. He threw himself at the melted charge. He didn't want to wait for the timer. He wanted to see the light. But he wanted to know that he had denied the Tallyman his prize. "Cadia stands!" he screamed, his voice breaking the high-frequency hum of the sump. He slammed his thumb down on the ignition stud. There was no sound. A melter charge doesn't explode like a frag grenade. It creates a localized sun, a fusion reaction that burns at temperatures that defy physics. For a microsecond, the heat-sink chamber was the brightest place in the galaxy. The promethium in the pipes didn't catch fire. It vaporized, the sheer pressure of the expanding gas turning the refinery's foundations into a mounting volcano. Elias Thorne felt nothing. The heat moved faster than his nervous system could register pain. In the space between heartbeats, the shadows were erased. The Nurglings, the spawn, and the plague marine in the dugout above, all of them were reduced to their component atoms. The Tallyman's ledger didn't just lose a name. The page was burned away. Outside the warp fold, in the cold reality of the Atria system, the divine verdict fired. A beam of pure, white energy descended from the sky, striking Sector 7 with the wrath of a vengeful god. The orbital lance met the rising promethium explosion halfway through the crust of the planet. The resulting cataclysm cracked the continent. The silence that followed was absolute. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of the rot, but the sterile, hollow vacuum of total annihilation. High above Atria III, the inquisitorial representative stood on the bridge of the divine verdict. He watched the view screen as the white pillar of the orbital lance dissipated, leaving a glowing, glass-rimmed crater where Sector 7 had once been. The Auspex chimes were steady now. No warp signatures, no biological anomalies. The ledger had been balanced by fire. "The sanctification is complete," a tech priest droned, his mechanical voice devoid of triumph. "The pocket has collapsed. The materium is stable." The Inquisitor turned away, his mind already moving to the next system, the next plague, the next tally. Record the 99th Cadian as lost in glory. Their sacrifice has preserved the subsector. Deep within the cooling glass of the crater, something flickered. It wasn't a soul, and it wasn't a survivor. It was a fragment of a memory, a lingering echo of a man who had refused to become a garden. In the warp, time is not a line, but a circle, and though Elias Thorne's body was ash, the defiance of his final moment remained. In the gardens of the plague god, a Tallyman sat upon a throne of weeping books. He held a quill made from a crow's wing and ran a finger down a list of names that stretched back to the dawn of time. He reached the entry for Atria III, Sector 7. The ink on the page began to smoke. Before his single, milky eye, the name Thorne didn't just fade. It turned to a white-hot spark that burned through the parchment, through the desk, and through the floor of the manse itself. The Tallyman hissed, a sound like 100 punctured lungs. He looked at the hole in his ledger, a void where a soul should have been. For the first time in an eternity, the count was wrong. The mathematics of despair had failed. On a distant world, months later, a fresh shipment of Cadian replacements arrived at a new trench line. They stepped off the Valkyries with their boots polished and their laser guns held high. Among them was a young trooper, barely 20 years old. He looked out at the gray rain and the mud of a new war, feeling a sudden, inexplicable shiver. He reached into his pocket and found a small, scorched piece of metal. It was an Aquila pendant, its wings melted and its surface blackened by a heat no forge could produce. He didn't know where it came from. He had found it in his kit bag after the warp jump. "You all right, Thorne?" his sergeant barked. The young trooper closed his hand over the metal, feeling a strange phantom warmth radiating from it. "Yes, Sergeant," he replied, his voice steady. "Just thinking." "Thinking about what?" "That we aren't alone in the dark." The sergeant snorted and gestured to the firing step. "Don't get poetic on me, son. Just keep your eyes on the fog. The Emperor protects." "No, Sarge," the boy whispered, looking at the gray horizon with eyes that seemed to see a different light. "We protect the Emperor." The story of the 99th Cadian was never written in the official histories of the Imperium. To the Lords of Terror, they were merely a rounding error in a galaxy of endless war. But in the cracks between reality, where the rot meets the flame, and the legend of the trooper who burned the ledger remains. Horror in the trenches is not the presence of death, it is the loss of the self. And as long as one man holds a guttering candle against the night, the darkness can never truly claim the victory. The rain on this new world, Ocularis Prime, did not smell of rot. It smelled of ozone and wet stone, a clean, biting scent that should have been a comfort. Yet, for the young trooper Thorne, the weight in his pocket was a constant, pulsing reminder that clean was a luxury the galaxy rarely afforded for long. The trenches here were deep, carved into the basalt crust of a moon that sat on the edge of the Eye of Terror. The Cadian 101st had been dug in for weeks, waiting for a traitor guard splinter fleet to make planetfall. The atmosphere was thick with the rhythmic thump-thump of Earthshaker cannons from the rear lines, a sound that the other recruits found deafening. To Thorne, it was the only thing that kept the silence at bay. "You're twitching again, Elias," Sergeant Kane grunted, leaning against the trench wall as he lit a LHO stick. You've been jumpy since we left the transport. It's just rocks and rain, son. The heretics are still 3 systems out." "It's not the heretics I'm worried about, Sarge," Thorne muttered, his hand tightening around the melted Aquila in his pocket. "Then what? The ghosts?" Kane laughed, a dry hacking sound. "Every Cadian carries a ghost or 2. It's part of the kit." Thorne didn't answer. He couldn't explain the dreams. He couldn't explain why. When he closed his eyes, he didn't see the black sand beaches of his childhood, but a flickering, white-hot heat and the smell of roses growing in a sewer. He couldn't explain the voice that whispered in the static of his vox bead, a voice that sounded like grinding metal and wet parchment, endlessly reciting a tally that was missing a single soul. That night, the sky above Ocularis Prime curdled. But it wasn't a storm. It was a warp shudder. The stars seemed to bleed, turning a bruised purple that Thorne recognized with a sickening jolt of familiarity. The Earthshaker cannons fell silent. One by one, the Vox units across the line began to emit a low-frequency hum, a sound like a million insects rubbing their legs together. "Positions!" Kane roared, his humor vanishing as he drew his chainsword. "Fix bayonets! Vox officer, get me a link to command!" "I can't, Sarge," the officer screamed, tearing his headset off. It's just someone counting, over and over. They're counting us." Thorne stood on the firing step, his laser gun leveled at the tree line. The fog was rolling in, but it wasn't the gray mist of a mountain morning. It was a sickly, jaundiced yellow, pulsating with an internal, necrotic light. It vibrated in the melted metal in his pocket. "He found us," Thorne whispered, his voice steady even as the men around him began to weep. "He came to finish the count." Out of the yellow fog, the shadows began to emerge. They weren't soldiers. They were the absences of light, silhouettes of men in Cadian armor, their forms burned into the very air. At their head walked a giant in rusted, weeping ceramite, a single horn protruding from his helm, and a scythe that dripped with black ichor. The Plague Marine stopped at the edge of the trench, his single green eye lens locking onto Thorne. "The spark," the giant rumbled, his voice a wet, vibrating bass that drowned out the screams of the dying. "So the one that burned the page. The grandfather does not forget a debt, little mortal, and the Tallyman has come to collect." Thorne didn't pray. He didn't scream. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the melted Aquila. It was glowing now, a faint, white-hot radiance that pushed back the yellow fog. "The tally's still short," Thorne said, his voice ringing out over the trenches with a clarity that defied the warp. "And it's gonna stay that way." He didn't fire his laser gun. He held the Aquila high, the light from the metal reflecting in his eyes that had seen the fire of the melter and the cold of the void. The battle for Ocularis Prime had begun, but for Elias Thorne, it was just the continuation of a long, dark night. And in the grim darkness of the far future, there is no peace, only the man who refuses to be counted. The yellow fog didn't just obscure vision, it tasted of copper and ancient, sunless damp. As the Plague Marine stepped onto the lip of the trench, the basalt rock beneath his rusted boots began to soften into a dark, porous peat. The soldiers of the Cadian 101st, men who had been raised on tales of iron discipline, were collapsing. Not from wounds, but from the sudden, overwhelming weight of their own mortality. "Look at them, Spark," the giant rumbled, gesturing with a hand that dripped with a translucent, syrupy filth. "Their strength is a thin veneer over a core of rot. You're the only one who burns. You're the only one who keeps the Tallyman's ledger from closing." Sergeant Kane lunged forward, his chainsword roaring to life with a desperate, mechanical scream. The teeth of the blade bit into the Plague Marine's thigh, spraying a mixture of black ichor and pressurized gas. The giant didn't even flinch. He looked down at the sergeant with a detached, almost fatherly pity, and then back-fisted him. The blow sent Kane through a reinforced plasteel support beam, which snapped like a dry twig. Thorne stepped forward, the melted Aquila in his hand, now pulsing with a heat that made his palm blister. The metal wasn't just glowing, it was vibrating at a frequency that seemed to hurt the air itself. "Why me?" Thorne asked, his voice steady. "I'm just a replacement, a name on a manifest." "You are the echo of the man who said no," the giant replied, raising his massive scythe. "In a galaxy of trillions who say yes to the inevitable, the man who says no is a flaw in the design. No, and the Tallyman hates a messy page." The shadows behind the giant, the silhouettes of the dead Cadian 99th, began to move. They didn't attack. They began to circle Thorne, their voiceless mouths opening in a silent, rhythmic chant. The ground beneath Thorne's feet began to ripple, and the smell of the roses returned, cloying and sweet, trying to numb his senses. Thorne realized the trap. The giant wasn't there to kill him with the scythe. He was there to make Thorne accept the gift. If Thorne faltered, if he allowed the despair of the 101st to seep into his soul, the tally would be completed, and the fire he carried would be extinguished forever. "The Emperor protects," Thorne whispered, but the words felt distant, like a memory of a memory. "The Emperor is a corpse on a throne of gold," the giant countered, his voice a soothing, a liquid bass. "He demands your blood, he demands your silence, but the Grandfather, he wants your song. He wants you to bloom in the garden of the eternal." Thorne looked at the men around him. They were turning. Their skin was graying, their eyes clouding with the sapphire blue film of the warp rot. Even Cain was twitching in the mud, a small pale mushroom sprouting from his ear. Thorne didn't raise his laser gun. He knew the red light of the weapon would be swallowed by the fog. Instead, he pressed the glowing, melted aquila against his own forehead. The pain was a white-hot spike that shattered the sweet lethargy of the spores. It wasn't the heat of a melted charge, but the searing cold of absolute, unyielding duty. Thorne felt the connection, the bridge between his soul and the soul of the man who had died in the heat sink of Atria III. "I am Elias Thorne," he roared, the name becoming a weapon, "and I am not your anchor." He didn't run. He didn't hide. He thrust the glowing metal directly into the chest of the Plague Marine, right into the weeping, fly-blown hole where the giant's heart should have been. The reaction was instantaneous. The white light of the aquila met the black rot of the Marine, and for a second, the yellow fog turned to a blinding, iridescent silver. The giant let out a sound that wasn't a scream, but a long, slow sigh of a mountain collapsing. The scythe fell. The shadows of the 99th vanished. The yellow fog didn't dissipate, it burned. Thorne felt his vision go white. He felt the mud beneath him turn back to hard, cold basalt. And then he felt the weight of a hand on his shoulder. "Easy, son. You're home." Thorne opened his eyes. The fog was gone, but the Plague Marine was gone. He was lying in a medici tent, the sterile smell of antiseptic a sharp, wonderful contrast to the scent of roses. A sister of the Order Hospitalia was leaning over him, her face a mask of calm, professional concern. "The 101st?" Thorne rasped. "They're recovering," she said softly. "A localized warp incursion. It was intense. But it broke. The Inquisitor says the balance shifted." Thorne reached for his pocket. It was empty. The melted aquila was gone. "Did you find a piece of metal? An aquila?" The sister paused, her eyes flickering. "No, trooper. We found you holding nothing but a handful of ash. But your fever, it broke the moment we brought you in." Thorne lay back against the thin, hard cot. He looked at his hands. They were scarred, the skin etched with the faint, white lines of a fire that didn't burn. He knew the Tallyman was still out there. He knew the ledger was still open, but he also knew that somewhere in the dark, the fire was still catching. "Cadia stands," he whispered to the silent tent, and for the first time in a lifetime, he didn't hear a reply. The piece of the medici tent was a lie. Thorne knew it the moment the sister of the Hospitalia turned her back. The antiseptic smell was fading, replaced by a faint, persistent scent of ozone. The smell of the void, or perhaps the smell of a door that had been left ajar. He stood up, his legs feeling like hollow glass. He wasn't in the 101st's camp anymore. He looked out the tent flap and saw not the basalt plains of Ocularis Prime, but a shimmering, iridescent landscape where the sky was the color of a fresh bruise. The tents were giant, translucent bladders, pulsing with a rhythmic, organ-like thrum. "The tally is never zero, Elias," a voice whispered. It wasn't the Plague Marine. It was the voice of 1,000 scratching quills. Thorne turned to find a figure sitting on a stool of bone. It was thin, draped in robes of tattered parchment that were inscribed with names in every language of the galaxy. It had no face, only a single, massive eye lens where a head should be, and its fingers were long, ink-stained needles. The Tallyman. "You burned my page," the entity said, and the sound was like paper tearing. "You created a void in the great work. I do not like voids. They are untidy." Thorne didn't have his laser gun. He didn't have his armor. He stood in a simple hospital gown, his skin pale and etched with the white scars of the Atria fire. "I didn't do it for your ledger. I did it because it was my job." "Your job was to die," the Tallyman countered, the needle fingers twitching. "Instead, you became a ghost in the machine. You have been skipping between the lines of fate like a stone across a pond. But stones eventually sink." The Tallyman stood, and as he moved, the parchment robes trailed behind him, revealing that they weren't just fabric. They were the skins of the 99th, the 101st, and every soul Thorne had ever known. "I offer you a trade, Spark. Give me the memory of the fire. Give me the moment you said no. Let me write it back into the book as a yes, and I will return you to your world. You will live a long life. You will forget the smell of the roses. You will die in a warm bed, surrounded by people who love you." Thorne felt the temptation. It was a physical pull, a sweet, heavy weight in his chest. To forget, to be normal, to not be the man who carries the sun in a world of mud. "And if I don't?" Thorne asked. "Then you remain here," the Tallyman said, gestured to the bruised sky. "In the garden of failed math, you will be counted among the irrational numbers, the fragments that do not fit. You will be forgotten by the Emperor and the Warp alike." Thorne looked at the single eye lens of the entity. He saw his own reflection, a small, tired man in a white gown. He looked at his hands, the hands that had shattered the valve and held the glowing Aquila. "I've spent my whole life being told I'm just a number," Thorne said, his voice growing stronger. "A serial number on a rifle, a casualty count on a report, a mark on a ledger. But the fire wasn't a number. It was me." He stepped toward the Tallyman, his bare feet sinking into the soft, pulsating ground. "If I'm a void in your book, then keep it that way. I'd rather be a hole in your math than a lie in your garden." The Tallyman let out a shriek of static. The parchment robes began to swirl, the names on the robes screaming as they were caught in a sudden, violent wind. The landscape of the garden began to dissolve, the translucent bladders bursting into sprays of black ink. "Then you shall be the nothing," the Tallyman roared. Thorne didn't run. He closed his eyes and reached for the place where the Aquila used to be. He didn't find metal. He found the heat. Not the heat of a melter charge, but the heat of a Cadian heart that refused to stop beating. He didn't scream a battle cry. He simply exhaled. The white light erupted from his chest, a blinding, silent explosion that tore through the parchment robes and shattered the bone stool. It wasn't an orbital strike. It was a soul asserting its right to be uncounted. Thorne woke up. He was in a transport ship. In the rhythmic thrum of the engines, a steady, mechanical heartbeat. He was strapped into a jump seat, his laser gun held between his knees. Around him, the men of a new regiment, the 112th, were checking their gear. "You all right, Thorne?" a young recruit asked, looking at him with wide, nervous eyes. "You were out for the whole warp jump." Thorne looked at his hands. They were steady. He reached into his pocket and felt a small, jagged piece of stone, a fragment of the basalt from Ocularis Prime. "I'm fine," Thorne said. "Think the heretics are going to be tough on this one?" Thorne looked at the boy. He saw the fear, the youth, and the potential for 1,000 different tallies. He reached out and squeezed the recruit's shoulder. "Doesn't matter how tough they are," Thorne said, his voice low and certain. "Huck, as long as we remember who we are." The red light of the transport bay began to flash. The doors began to groan open, revealing the smoke and fire of a new battlefield. Thorne stood up, his armor clattering, his laser gun humming as he flicked the safety off. He was just a man, he was just a soldier. But in the grim darkness of the far future, that was enough to break the world. The horror in the trenches is not found in the monsters we face, but in the fear that we are insignificant. Elias Thorne proved that in a galaxy of gods and demons, the most terrifying thing to the darkness is a single human soul that refuses to be added up. The Tallyman still waits. The garden still grows. But the fire is catching. The descent was a violent, shuddering descent into the red-hot throat of a planet called Malkor 5. The 112th were not elite shock troops. They were the dregs and the survivors, the men and women who had fallen through the cracks of other wars and been hammered together into a new shield for the Imperium. As the Valkyrie's floor plates buckled under the atmospheric pressure, Thorne looked at the faces around him. They were terrified. They were the irrational numbers the Tallyman had spoken of, the messy, beautiful fragments of a humanity that refused to be neat. 30 seconds, the pilot screamed over the Vox. Hot drop. If you don't jump, you burn with the bird. Thorne stood. His movements were no longer the frantic, twitchy jerks of the man in Sector 7. He moved with a heavy, deliberate grace, till he didn't feel the shadow in the warp, and he didn't smell the cloying scent of roses. He felt only the cold, hard weight of his laser gun and the jagged basalt shard in his pocket. The bay doors hissed open. Malkor Fi was a world of soot-blackened spires and endless, rain-slicked trenches. It was an industrial hellscape where the traitor guard had dug in deep, turning the planet's manufactorums into fortresses. Thorne jumped into the scream of the wind. He landed in a knee-deep mire of oily water and ash. Around him, the 112th was scrambling, the air filled with the criss-crossing traces of heavy stubbers and the brilliant, lethal snaps of lass fire. "Thorne, over here!" He saw a familiar face, or at least a face that felt familiar. It was the young recruit from the transport, huddling behind a shattered ferrocrete barrier. The boy's helmet was gone, and his eyes were wide with the sudden, brutal reality of the front. "What's the plan, Thorne?" the boy shouted, his voice cracking as a mortar shell detonated nearby, showering them in hot shrapnel. Thorne looked at the enemy lines. He didn't see the heretics. He saw the fog beginning to roll in from the ruins, the yellow, jaundiced fog that he knew all too well. It wasn't a coincidence. The Tallyman hadn't given up. He had simply followed the fire to its next destination. "The plan," Thorne said, grabbing the boy by the webbing and pulling him up, "is to stay alive and to make sure they regret every inch they take." Thorne didn't stay behind the barrier. He stepped out into the open, his laser gun raised. He wasn't firing at the traitor guard. He was firing at the fog. The fog shrieked and recoiled, unable to fog, shrieked and recoiled, unable to settle where Thorne stood. The traitor guardsmen, sensing a target that didn't flinch, turned their fire on him. A bullet grazed his cheek, another punched through his shoulder guard. Thorne didn't feel the pain. He felt the ledger. He felt the thousands of names of the 99th and the 101st, and he realized he wasn't carrying their ghosts. He was carrying their defiance. "Come on," Thorne roared, his voice cutting through the din of the artillery. "Is that all you've got? I've seen the end of the world. You're nothing." The soldiers of the 112th, seeing a man walk through the storm of fire as if he were made of stone, began to rise from their cover, and the fear that had paralyzed them was being replaced by a fierce, desperate pride. If a replacement like Thorne could stand, so could they. They charged. It wasn't a tactical maneuver, it was a riot. A wave of gray-clad Cadians swept over the trench lip, their bayonets gleaming in the dying light of Malkor's sun. In the heart of the yellow fog, a rusted bell began to toll. Clang, But this time, the sound was drowned out by the roar of the 112th. Thorne reached the enemy line, his bayonet finding the throat of a traitor who smelled of rot. He didn't stop. He pushed forward, deeper into the mist, searching for the giant with the single horn. He found him standing amidst a pile of smoldering machinery. The Plague Marine raised his scythe, but the movement was slow, heavy. "Stubborn thing," the giant rumbled. "But stubborn thing." The giant rumbled, but the liquid bass of his voice was thinned by a hiss of escaping gas. "The grandfather will have his garden, Elias. If not today, then in 10,000 years." "Then I'll see you in 10,000 years," Thorne said. He didn't use a melter charge this time. He used his laser gun, holding the trigger down until the barrel glowed cherry red, pouring the entire contents of his power cell into the giant's visor. The Plague Marine collapsed, his armor dissolving into a pile of rust and foul-smelling sludge. The yellow fog began to lift, the sun of Malkor 5 breaking through the smog for the first time in months. Thorne stood in the center of the clearing, his laser gun empty. "Thorne! They're retreating!" Thorne looked at him, his face covered in soot, but his eyes bright. "We took the sector, Thorne. They're retreating." Thorne looked at the boy, then at the sky. He reached into his pocket and felt the basalt shard. It was cold now, just a piece of stone. "Good," Thorne said, his voice a tired, rasping whisper. "Let's get ready for the next one." On the bridge of an inquisitorial black ship, a high-ranking member of the Ordo Sepulturum looked over a series of reports from Malkor 5. He paused at a casualty list, or rather, the lack of one. A single platoon had performed with a statistical anomaly of courage and survival that defied all models of warp contamination. "What is the name of the NCO in charge of that unit?" the Inquisitor asked. "Thorne, my lord. Elias Thorne." The Inquisitor tapped a finger against his chin, his mind scanning the ancient tallies of the dead. The name sounded familiar, like a ghost of a file he had once closed. "Watch him," the Inquisitor commanded. Men like that are either the salvation of the Imperium or the fuel for its final pyre. Either way, the galaxy is never the same after they pass through. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But as long as Trooper Thorne is in the trenches, the war has a soul. The end. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.